traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories, the Muslim people. Bonnie, oh, thank you. Um, Josephine is not here today, so it's my pleasure to introduce Tarun. Professor Tarun Khanna is he's a assistant professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, one of my colleagues there, and we have offices 2 doors from each other, so I know him quite well from there, that context. So he's a professor of energy and climate policy. He's an economist. He studied economics at the University of Delhi, and then specialized in energy economics during his PhD at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change at Berlin, and associated with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change, if some of you know that. But Mercator is, I guess, a new institute that's affiliated with the Potsdam.
At this point, it's been absorbed back into Potsdam.
Okay. Things move around.
Yeah.
He's interested in the economics of the energy sector and incentives needed to create low carbon energy systems. His wider research interests include evidence synthesis, policy evaluation, electricity markets, and the role of clean energy in development. Another interesting thing is that before coming to academia, he was actually a policy practitioner. He worked with regulators, governments, utilities, and so on in designing electricity policy in South Asia. So pleased to have him talk to us. Like, he's going to talk to us about some of his evidence synthesis work today. Thanks, Tarun.
Okay. Thanks, Naveen, for that kind introduction. As Naveen mentioned, so I sort of wear these 2 hats. A lot of my work is the very much economist work of demand, supply, and estimating econometrics stuff. But today, what I thought I will talk about something which is the second hat or the second research interest of mine, which is this exploring this idea of evidence-based policy. And really more, but also evidence-based policy in the context of climate policy and climate solutions. So just to sort of move this forward. No, this was just working. Yeah, it was just working when we tested it. Okay. No. Should we try now? Oh, there you go. Perfect. Okay. Now let's hope that the AV system keeps cooperating. But yeah, just to sort of give a broader outline, we are sort of stuck in the age of fossil fuels, right? And I think this is something that none of us need to be reminded of again in this room, but we really have very little time left to move towards the net zero pathways that we keep talking about. So essentially, 25 years is all we have by when a lot of governments have committed to the idea of net zero. And the role of climate policy in this is obviously not to be underestimated. However, what climate policies work, under what conditions and why, is an area that is still highly, highly unclear. We need evidence, and that's going to be my pitch in this audience. We need evidence because we cannot afford to make mistakes or waste resources. Governments have multiple priorities. If you look at just the Sustainable Development Goals, there are often many and conflicting. Electorates are not exactly feeling happy at the moment, the world over. Interest rates, rising inflation has put governments on the back foot, has limited rooms for fiscal expenditure, which forms the basis of a lot of the policy work or policy incentives that we have been doing traditionally. And lastly, the people themselves are not necessarily always happy with climate policies that might be implemented. So all in all, it becomes really crucial to try and understand how much is it that we need to do, but also how can we do it the best way. And can sort of policymakers turn towards science for the answer? In a short answer is yes, right? So the amount of scientific research on climate keeps increasing year by year. So this is the chart that shows us how climate research has increased over the last 3 decades. If you only look at the Web of Science, we have probably at this point, this chart is a bit outdated. We have about 1 million research articles which come up if you search for climate relevant research. So in some sense, we're doing a great job as a scientific community of providing knowledge. But on the other hand, we're also overwhelming. It's also the era of overwhelming scientific knowledge. How is anyone supposed to make sense of all this information that's coming out? It becomes even more important when that information doesn't necessarily always make sense or seems to be, at least prima facie, inconsistent, right? So I'm from India, WhatsApp, India runs on WhatsApp, and almost not a day goes by without my uncle sending me one news article about how cancer is caused by something. And a lot of times it's, everything. So, at some point it's everything, eating everything can prevent cancer, can give you cancer, and that's what essentially happens. And when my uncle can be be happily inconsistent in his forwards to me, as scientists, we cannot be so inconsistent in our policy advice as to what works and what doesn't. So how do we go from this? And this is, just to know that this is not a problem of bad science necessarily. Of course, there might be some, rather motivated research coming from some quarters, but even in general, with all good intentions, sometimes science just produces mixed results, or depending on the context, depending on the statistical nature of findings sometimes, right? So the fact that we have conflicting evidence is not necessarily bad science, it's just a process of science. But then how do you go from there to providing meaningful consensus or arriving at meaningful consensus? I argue that what we need to do is really focus on systematic evidence synthesis to learn from what primary research is out there. What is evidence synthesis? Well, in many ways, it's very similar to primary research that we do. We start out with a research question, a research problem that we are curious about, and we go about designing a search strategy to systematically review all the literature that is out there on the particular topic. And I think I have to emphasize that it needs to be systematic, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be replicable, and it needs to be open. And it needs to be comprehensive. Without that, the search is not systematic, and we cannot really be claiming to representing the wider scientific knowledge base. The second step, of course, is then selecting what is relevant and what can be used to provide evidence for the particular question. And lastly, using transparent synthesis methodologies that can bring together evidence from all these different sources in a meaningful way, while at the same time understanding and representing quality as a measure, or doing a critical appraisal of the evidence that's out there. So not really just rehashing everything or giving just a simple average of everything that's out there, but rather weighing it by different standards as well that it represents. So that's the general process, and that's a simple idea, right? Are we doing it enough? And I don't think we are. Even though within climate science, it's not such an absurd thing. The IPCC assessments have essentially built on synthesizing evidence from or ideas from the modeling community. So we're relatively good as a climate science community in bringing together evidence from modeling to comparisons about what can happen, why climate change is caused, what are the different pathways for decarbonization, and there's sort of an active community to do that. Whereas on the climate instrument side or climate policy side, we do not really have such a mechanism that exists as of now. It's very much fragmented, and more often than not, even IPCC assessments will rely on individual primary studies for their assessment of what climate solutions need to be put forward. And it more often than not will then depend on who's actually doing some of this synthesis work, right? Or who's on the chapter lead to assessing or bringing together the knowledge. So this gap is even more clear if you look at the amount of evidence synthesis that gets done in climate policy. So if we look at as a field, a very small percentage of papers published within the climate space tend to be on systematic reviews or meta-analyses. The situation is a little bit different for climate and health, primarily because health as a community itself has relied for long on evidence-based policy making, even though this was not the case always. And I think it's easy to forget that health sciences also did not always rely on clinical trials and gathering evidence from multiple clinical trials before really putting forward a guideline. And in some sense, it's kind of surprising that we don't do that in every field, even though even outside of health, things like education policy, international development have long been now subjected to high levels of policy evaluation methods and evidence synthesis. So within these communities, for example, there's something called as What Works clearinghouses in the United States, which will gather evidence on education policy, for example. And there's a lot of spirit of experimentation, trial, and then gathering evidence from those experiments into informing future policy. And that's something which I feel is missing from the climate space, and something that we probably as a community can move towards. So you can see that my talk is a bit of like, giving you background of my research, but also like a sort of a call to arms of, we need to do this more. And that's intentional. I think I wanted to use this forum to also bring out this idea a little bit more. But I also wanted to highlight why, and I'm going to move a little bit now more towards the idea of evidence synthesis per se, and systematic reviews and meta-analysis as a way of doing that. Because in some sense, we all do what we think is collecting evidence from across the field, right? Like whenever we start a research project, we do a literature review, and then there are multiple literature reviews that get published on everything all the time. However, it's, I think, important to, realize, and I'm sure that most of you will not disagree, that traditional reviews are sometimes not comprehensive. They may or may not be very transparent in how they derive their findings. This is an interesting review, and I just take this as an example, which was published around does carbon pricing reduce carbon emissions? And it's a review of ex post analysis in the field. And the review concluded that carbon pricing schemes have reduced emissions by 0 to 2%. Essentially, they haven't reduced carbon emissions, right? That's basically the conclusion from this review, which is almost surprising given that the studies that they included didn't really seem to be saying that, at least not prima facie. And the authors did not really go into great details about how they derive this conclusion or what sort of weights do they give on particular studies, right? So we can essentially, my idea is that this is not an exception. We can get away with things like that in a lot of, if you do not define clear boundaries of how to systematically aggregate evidence, and what are the, and we're not transparent in how we are doing so. Almost as a response to this paper, we actually did a systematic review and evidence for climate, for carbon pricing, and does it work or not? And our conclusions was somewhat different, because when we aggregated the literature, which was more comprehensive, so we did not focus on a set of literature that we found interesting, but rather, I think search at some point, our initial search query had something like 80,000 paper abstracts, and then sort of whittled it down to the final number, which was more than 100, which were 98 studies which were relevant. We didn't really necessarily find that carbon pricing does not work. And the extent to which it works, the magnitude, does differ based on whether you include studies that are the gold standard, that are the highest quality, or studies which sometimes lack certain statistical rigor or explanatory power. And that's the other point of doing things systematically, that it can help you understand the state of the field itself, right? So, for example, what we discovered was that only about 50% of the effect sizes come from studies that can be called to have a low risk of bias. That means if they're assessed on their quality in terms of, we have a sort of risk of bias assessment matrix, which looks at everything from the statistical methods used to reporting. We found that only about 50% of studies really come from those, and only about 30% are adequately statistically powered. But interestingly, this cacophony of voices that I was mentioning earlier, so those conflicting results where everything seems to either work or not work, or have these like really wide ranges, that seems to whittle down a bit when you start looking at evidence which really has high explanatory power or low risk of bias. So the numbers do not look as out of sync with each other anymore as they do when you are including basically everything. So the idea is pointing to primary literature can sometimes be very misleading and confusing if you do not have methods to resolve the confusion a bit. So what's the way forward? And this was just a starting point when we got interested in carbon pricing and does it work or not. But obviously, policymakers are much more interested in just knowing whether carbon pricing reduces emissions or not, right? There are multiple criteria on which a policy needs to be assessed. So whether it's effectiveness or equity, or what's the impact on labor market, innovation, for example, in case of carbon pricing. And as a project, we are now embarking on this idea of doing high quality evidence synthesis for each of these different dimensions to bring together evidence from these different sources, and then stitching them together into what we call ecosystem of reviews, to be able to really talk about what the impact of those policies might be. I want to give another example of this idea. This is an ecosystem of systematic reviews on interventions to reduce household emissions. This is a project that I've been involved in for about 4 years now, and with partners in Germany and the UK, where we have looked at interventions in household consumption of different goods and services, and trying to see what is the effectiveness of certain kinds of interventions in reducing consumption and therefore emissions. So we look at food, transport, buildings, emissions. And the kind of interventions we're looking at are what you would call demand-side interventions almost. So things like monetary incentives to reduce consumption or change dietary habits, information provision, feedback, social comparison. So broadly, a lot from in the space of behavioral economics. And we try and harmonize the definitions and the ideas across all these different reviews that we do, so that ultimately what we get from the different reviews that we do, so we essentially did separate reviews for all these different sectors, but also within the sectors for different research questions to again try and build the sort of evidence picture overall. And does it work, or what do we learn? Well, I think that we have been able to put together a more comprehensive picture, because when we started off with this field, it was again a similar sort of cacophony of voices, at least what appeared to us, that there were a number of conflicting messages about which interventions worked and to what extent. And the biggest problem also was that there was no harmonized way of defining interventions. So depending upon who the authors of either a review or the primary study is, they were defining interventions quite differently, and then becomes challenging to really make sense of the results which are coming from there. By harmonizing information, we are able to at least give some general ideas. And I can go more into the details of this, and it's also something which is still pretty much a work in progress, actually. So what we do, for example, are able to say is that monetary incentives are useful when it comes to short-term decision-making in households. So for example, with energy use in households, we see by far the most strongest impact is from monetary incentives. So pricing signals or rewards and rebates work really well in getting people to change their consumption habits in households, in daily use activities for energy. However, the same doesn't really apply when you try and think about their willingness to pay for efficient appliances. So things where you have long-term decision-making framework, where if you are going to purchase a big refrigerator or washing machine, giving people incentives or subsidies or rebate doesn't necessarily seem to work a lot better than giving them more information about the trade-offs involved, or in fact giving some sort of signal that this appliance is worse than the others. And the overall aggregate effect is also varies, but like the relative effect varies as well. And when it comes to food choices, what we find is that actually incentives are not necessarily the best anymore at all, whereas things like defaults and decision-making and availability actually changes people's options and actions a lot more. We are also able to tease out, and this is something which we are only able to do with the whole bigger systematic review, and the fact that we have data from several studies together, is to put together this idea that single interventions don't necessarily do the best always. In fact, packages of interventions, so when you combine things like monetary incentives with information and some sort of motivation technique, that seems to work best actually in promoting behavior change. But also there are certain combinations that seem to backfire. So if you combine monetary incentives with feedback on energy consumption, and feedback which is also given in a particular way, then it seems to be actually less effective. And this is something that we are able to establish across the literature, while there are, again, contradictory results from individual studies sometimes around this. Of course, meta-analysis is not a solution to everything, especially quantitative meta-analysis is not a solution to everything. So for example, we're not able to understand why some of these combinations work better than the others. And for that, it's something that we want to move further and try and work more with mixed methods or qualitative methods to really try and tease out what those implications or associations might be. I want to sort of come back to my bigger idea of how we can move the field forward. And one of the ways, again, that we are trying to do this is the idea of a living review. This is something that has become, has originated, again, in the health space, but is very much now, I think, applicable even within the climate space, given the increasing amount of evidence that comes out every year. So for our carbon pricing review, for example, we are trying to convert it into a living review. with the idea being that the review is, once you do it, you don't just shelve it for the next 4 years and then forget about it. And then the next time somebody has to do the review, they start off from scratch again. The other problem is that, when evidence is actually required, these reviews take a long time and a lot of effort. So if you're going to start from scratch when a question has already been posed, it's usually too late by the time you come out with an answer. So the attempt with the living review is to create knowledge and keep it updated so that it's available to use whenever you need it. And here, what we have definitely found very helpful is the recent advances in machine learning, which can substantially reduce the effort. So one of the, by far the most time-consuming process, so if any of you get interested after this talk and really are interested in doing systematic reviews but don't find it daunting or like it's too time-consuming, well, the good news is that there are methods which are emerging on the field with machine learning advances that helps really reduce work significantly. So for example, one of the big part about, one of the most effort-intensive parts of doing a review can be the literature search and identifying the relevance research. And machine learning algorithms have become substantially better in doing this. So in our work right now, the last 2 reviews that we've done, we've used predictive learning and machine learning algorithms to reduce our work by what we estimate at least 80 to 90%. It also helps, and I think that will continue to be the case. So another helpful area with machine learning is just tagging papers. And you can do this in a very sort of automated manner now for something like a living review, where as new papers keep coming, they automatically get screened and get tagged as relevant or not. And you're able to maintain that flow when required. However, there are other areas which are more promising, but where we don't necessarily have clear solutions yet, but we are hopeful, is areas like automatic data extraction. This is a place where some of my colleagues are working intensively to be able to remove the step of manually having to read studies and extract information on what the findings are. Similarly, for quality assessment, which is, again, this is where probably I have not as much hope, because I think this is primarily a very judgment-based exercise as well. But what it can really help is doing something called as double coding. So in gold standard reviews, we usually have 2 people doing quality assessment for each primary study and not just one, to ensure that there are no biases of the reviewer itself. And this is where I feel that machine learning can really help in being that second reviewer, so to speak. And lastly, some of my colleagues with whom I'm working, again, with this data set on behavioral interventions, is to be able to use LLMs to actually just do the synthesis itself. It's very much experimental right now. The idea is you take the data extract from the studies and you let the LLMs actually give you an output of what the average effect might be in different situations. And obviously, it's not clear why or where that comes from, but it's an interesting idea that is being explored. We also have some decent advances in the statistical understanding of meta research, which can really be helpful in extracting, making sense of the data that you extract from studies. So one of the big problems in evidence synthesis that I faced in my work early on was, how do you really figure out what is relevant, right? So which variables affect your, if you have 10 studies, the context or the characteristics of the studies themselves might actually be affecting your result and not really something else. And how do you figure out what those 10 things are? So recent advances in Bayesian model averaging, for example, can help you extract or meaningfully come to an answer for that. We also have some new research which is helping us deal more with problems of selection and publication bias in primary studies. So if your primary studies have inherently not used complete data sets or have reporting biases within them, so p-hacking is something that we are all familiar with. So how do you, for example, correct with p-hacking at the primary study level when you're doing synthesis and not compound those errors? I'm going to sort of conclude by saying that the hope is that we're able to, with these methodologies, with this effort, build some sort of evidence bank on a range of climate policy instruments. This is work that I'm definitely a part of, and we hope to get more people from the climate community to engage in, to be able to create this bank of knowledge across instruments and across sectors, to sort of be able to go from this cacophony of voices that talk over each other and compete for policymakers' attention to a somewhat more consolidated knowledge, which does not need to be perfect and does not need to be in agreement with each other all the time, but at least make more sense and can be more usable. Thank you very much.
Questions and reminder that we will try to thank you very much for your talk. Frankly, interesting to see the challenges that studies are out there. I noticed that the talk mostly focuses on climate action for mitigation. Have you looked at similar issues with adaptation, given the fact that it has its own set of challenges, like not being able to measure what's not there, what doesn't happen? Like there's an inherent problem in adaptation where it's hard to measure if you were able to avoid a disaster, things like that. Have you looked at adaptation separately, or do you have any insight as to how that might differ with?
Yeah. So the question is for the Zoom. The examples cited were more of mitigation. Is there something similar, or can these methods be similarly applied to adaptation? And yes, the short answer is because I work more in mitigation, so the examples really came from mitigation. But within the community, there are definitely people who are working on the adaptation side. I think what is slightly different with adaptation, because it's of the experimentation itself being relatively nascent stage, and the problems that you mentioned, we are really at one step behind in adaptation. So where the emphasis is really in trying to understand parts of the literature of the problem where evidence does not even exist, right? So there's someone called Leah Barang-Ford so you know Leah. So she's been doing, along with other colleagues, a lot of work in trying to use some of the techniques that I mentioned. So again, predictive machine learning, and to create systematic maps of where more evidence needs to be consolidated. And then I think the second step would be in terms of the synthesis work, which is actually not really advanced within that field as of now.
My question is that you mentioned that you like to create a knowledge base, like evidence bank to guide policy making. So I'm wondering, this knowledge bank you're creating more like facing like more like globally or to specific region or country, or is that possible for maybe in the future to let policymakers or stakeholders to interact with the knowledge bank, like inputting some parameters and then generate, the policy bank through a rep?
Right. So that's actually, I think, the biggest question that we are facing right now, how to orient the evidence bank, so to speak, and at what level it gets created. but the short answer is we've worked at both levels. So I am currently working on another project with the OECD, where we are using, again, evidence synthesis methods to try and find effectiveness of a range of policy instruments for reducing carbon emissions. So this is work that we are doing in collaboration with the OECD, and the idea is that OECD member countries can then use the information when they go back and take it back to their national context, right? So, of course, there's some knowledge that gets created at a global level, and then when you implement it, you have to contextualize it depending on the country. We also did that in a way for one example of doing that was with this work on behavioral interventions, where we use some of our work to inform the actions taken by German government during the energy crisis that they faced. So when there was sort of the need in 2022 to reduce energy consumption in Germany, based on our work, we put out policy advice citing what kind of demand side measures or interventions for household energy consumption can be taken by the German government. So the work can, in some sense, be done at both levels, and the idea is that it would be used at both levels.
I wonder if you could dig into the idea of those living reviews, how they could work given this current model of these publications that are published once and then sit in repositories where they're searchable. How would these living reviews interact with that system? How would people find them? How would they consult the kind of up-to-date discussion for that review? That might maybe if there was a paper written 2 years ago and these studies were added, how does that change?
Yeah, that's a great question and something that we are actually dealing with right now because I'm currently, oh, sorry, I have to repeat the question. So the question is, how do living reviews work in the current publication model, which essentially allows for a single publication to be indexed at a time, right? So we are currently facing that challenge because I'm part of a living review for, as I mentioned, for the carbon pricing work. And it's really actually pushing the publication houses to adapt and to evolve. So we are, talking with Nature publications a lot of time and trying to get them to see to figure out a way how because it's not just that review needs to get published once and then constantly needs to be updated. How will that be cited? So is it like a 2021 review? Is it a 2024 review? Who are the authors in each? Because author teams will shift over time. You cannot expect them to remain constant. So who gets credit for that? And some of the bigger publication houses are relatively more inflexible around this. But we do have some precedents. So again, Campbell Collaboration is a smaller publication house which has come on board with us for this particular endeavor. And they are being, and with Wiley, I think is the publisher, and they're pretty flexible in how we index it. So right now, the idea is that we kind of do it as a book, right? So the way you have chapters in a book, so you have a review, which is the book, and then the chapters keep getting updated over time. And then you can have sort of separate citations for each chapter with different author teams for each chapter, right? So that is one model that we are currently exploring with them. But yeah, and that's really tells you it's the problems of doing some of these things, right? So also in terms of, I would go one step further into how do you publish the data, right? So that's something that we, at least within the evidence synthesis community, is very clear. Every time you do a review, you put up all your data clearly on GitHub, index it, and refresh it. So that's a model that, again, we are going towards. Yeah.
I'm just thinking like the way international. Are you currently like included different
Yeah, so the question is, how are you accounting for research in other languages apart from English? And I think you sort of, the answer is you've got the Achilles heel of all our reviews, which is that we primarily, at least the work that I've done, has been obviously looking at research in English. And we are, where possible, we try and overcome that. I don't think machine learning is necessarily the biggest bottleneck. Again, as of now, none of our reviews are without human intervention. So the goal is that maybe you could have a completely automated review or maps, but we're some way off from that. And given the author teams, you need to necessarily have people from different languages, right? So for one of the reviews that we were involved, we included Spanish as a language because we had a Spanish speaker on board. But yeah, that is probably the biggest challenge in terms, and it's really a resource constraint more than anything else.
Back to title, what policies, what kind of conditions and why? So I was missing a little bit kind of how well conditions are reflected in the review processes, right? So here kind of on the slide, we have like stacking of different interventions. Thought would be maybe the economic conditions, political conditions would affect then the outcome of funding themselves, right? So maybe questions that go with the global policy kind of review and then your interpretation of in the German context.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how well kind of the general kind of conditions.
Yeah. So I think there are two answers there. One is what I presented here is more the quantitative methods, and even within quantitative methods, you can account for these things. I was trying to see if I have the slide on carbon pricing, which I don't. So within the carbon pricing review, for example, we do a heterogeneity analysis, which is to try and piece out what causes the variation in effect sizes across the different studies, which are the main drivers there. And there we try and account for the different structures of the schemes themselves, how they're designed, but also the context in which they operate. So which countries, for example, they come from. And you can do that using Bayesian model averaging again. So try and see if those variables sort of show up. That's a very quantitative way of doing it. But I will fully admit that quantitative methodology is not necessarily the best way of parsing out some of those questions always. So in this case, for example, we were able to at least figure out variations across different schemes, right? So these are again the social political context in which the schemes operate and how they differ. So that's something that we are able to do quantitatively. But equally, there's some very interesting work by Ruth Stewart on qualitative reviews and mixed methods approaches, which are then able to really speak more to that second piece on what conditions. I think that's, yeah, I'm not a qualitative researcher, and I'm trying to move more towards that as well myself, to do more like realist reviews, which are able to account for those differences better. I think that's the most interesting area of this field right now as well. Well,
Do the all normalize carbon tax? Each of these.
Right. So this graph is not normalized in terms of the average effect, the intensity of treatment is what we would call, right? But we do, again, do this heterogeneity analysis where we account for the intensity of treatment and see if that actually is what is driving the results or the differences across these different schemes that we see here. And the short answer is actually we don't think it's the intensity of the treatment that's necessarily, it's a bit unclear. There are two, there is some nuance there. It's not necessarily that the intensity itself is driving, because intensity is clouded with the socioeconomic setting of the scheme as well. But we do, and the problem is that there hasn't been a lot of variation of the intensity within schemes. So for example, if you think about the British, the biggest scheme one is the EU ETS, and the EU ETS prices haven't really moved a lot, at least till recently, to be able to parse out variations in what happens when the prices move. And similarly, for example, in BC, the prices didn't really move far enough for a long enough time to be able to find out those differences. So that's probably why we are not picking up the variation in intensity as well. So right. So in that, if you just look at the cross-sectional variation, in fact, sometimes the results can be counterintuitive, because the Chinese pilots, again, have a relatively small, high effect, but RGGI is the eastern US. So it's the PJM sort of area. But yeah, so here, it's not, again, the variation is not necessarily being driven by those cross-sectional differences in intensity, is the short answer. But there's some nuance there which I can get into. Right.
In terms of creating the tag related to different sectors. So, and are they trying to do it or say that we capture global scenario, global papers at a
Yeah. So there is, interestingly, in the recent IPCC, chair has put out a discussion paper on using systematic reviews for policy instrument evaluation. I can forward it to you if you're interested in listening. So I think there is some interest within the IPCC around this, and using systematic evidence synthesis for informing the climate policy chapters in the next round. It is, I think, a valid point that it cannot be done by IPCC itself, right? Like, obviously, this requires a lot of resources and times, and you cannot wait for the chapters to exist when, or the people who are leading the chapters will not be able to do all of this. So it really is going to be a community effort where these reviews are done beforehand, and then are being able, and the IPCC chapter leads can rely on the reviews for building their knowledge, or can cite those reviews. And there's, again, some community-wide effort to do this. There is a big sort of, at least with the climate and health space, there was recently a big project which was awarded to create such a knowledge bank, including the digital evidence synthesis methods required to go that way. But yeah, this is really more going to be a community effort. Yeah.
The related question is, like, there is no Cochrane type of institution for anything other than medicine, right? So maybe can you say a little bit about how Cochrane works and how you're funded?
That's a good question. The question is how Cochrane is the one that sort of organizes a lot of the reviews for health sciences. How do you replicate that for the climate space? So yeah, we don't really have Cochrane. We have Campbell collaboration, which is at least tries to do similarly, create a similar space within other social sciences, and they do a relatively more active job again in social policy. So in education research, this is quite well organized, and you have organizations like I mentioned the clearinghouses in the US, the 3IE. Again, the community is very sort of professionalized in many ways. For climate space, we are lacking any such organization. Campbell has a climate solutions group now, which is trying to lead more of this work. But yeah, resources obviously are an important constraint. I don't know. The answer is there's no good model that the money doesn't really exist, but we have to find it. And again, what I know is some of the people involved, there is some momentum there, so to speak, with, again, IPCC is showing some interest in moving this forward. And some of these, Campbell and I think Wellcome Trust has come up with a call, again, a proposal for putting in 45 million in evidence synthesis methods across fields. It's not just for climate, but again, climate will be a part of it. So that's an interesting development. Yes.
You're showing that the step for machine learning might support all the way up to writing up. Where do you think that challenges, right? Like how far away from the thing?
Yeah. Right. So I think so the question is, to what extent can we rely on machine learning to help us do this work? I think there are certain steps, as I mentioned. So what machine learning has been able to already help us quite a lot is with automatically searching, searching, tagging of literature, which might be relevant for specific research questions. So for example, a colleague at the institute that maybe mentioned, PIC, has created a climate policy instruments map. This is a living map which categorizes all climate policy relevant research into whether it's a regulatory instrument, is it carbon pricing, is it behavioral intervention, which sector does it belong to? So that tagging is done and categorized. Those banks are created. So if you want to know which are the relevant papers, you can just go and look at those. And you don't have to actually do this process yourself. And we're using this bank for the work with the OECD, for example. So it's fairly reliable already. And they have also developed statistical procedures to check this, that the algorithm is indeed able to capture, with some statistical certainty, most of the relevant literature out there. So this part of the job, we are already able to at least, and this used to be done manually, by the way, right? So you would basically design a query, you would put it in Web of Science, you'll get the data, then there'll be like team of students who will sit and review each abstract and say yes, no, or tag it. So this was already a very, very manually intensive job. And by creating, again, it was done manually for this project to train the machine learning algorithm, but now the algorithm is good enough to really sort of carry it forward for at least this part of the work, and to a with reliable accuracy. Where machine learning is still, like I said, not very good is areas like data extraction, quality assessment, and automatic synthesis, right? So I'm involved in one of these projects for synthesis. I think it's really hard, even for me, because I don't really understand, and obviously the teams themselves don't really understand how the LLMs are able to, for example, get the results that they do. So I think the synthesis bit is going to be the hardest part of using machine learning. my hope is that the data extraction bit becomes better. And I think that's going to be not just advances in machine learning, but also as a community, how better we get at reporting our results, right? So the better you are at reporting your results, the easier it becomes for algorithms to be able to extract information. So I think that's a sort of a two-way communication that'll happen. But that's really where I think there is definitely the next step and barrier. With the quality assessments, as I mentioned, I don't think you will be able to trust machine learning completely, at least as of now. Even the experiments that have been done with large language models, and again, these don't use the most recent ones, but the ones which were there last year, which of course is like now too long ago, but they were not necessarily, they were very good at being the second check for a human coder doing the quality assessment, but not necessarily better, or you couldn't rely on them completely to do it all by themselves. So depends on the question part of the process. If you're interested in some of this, there's a lab at Stanford which looks at meta research, and they sort of invite researchers to talk about the latest machine learning methods and other methods in methods research. It's called Metrics, the name of the research group at Stanford, and they have a seminar series which is available online.
Find Tarun at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the U Institute. All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Tarun.
Thank you very much.